Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the last schools group event in 2023. In a moment, I will hand over to Claire Archibald, our speaker, who will take us through the next hour with some very interesting content. Just a few things housekeeping before we start. Claire will take questions at the end, so if you can either put your question in the chat or in the on the questions tab, then I will keep an eye on the questions and we will deal with all of those at the end of the presentation. Please feel free to use the chat, but as always, I would say please keep it healthy and constructive. I know I'm speaking to people who would do that anyway, but this is just a precaution to make sure that we all use the chat in a good way. So without any further ado, I will now hand over to Claire to take us through the next hour. So over to you, Claire.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Thank you, everybody, for joining today. I'm so pleased that so many of you have signed up for the third of my 3 sessions over the course of the year for the IRMS Schools Group. Today, we're going to be looking at how to achieve a positive data protection compliance culture in your school. For those of you who haven't spoken to me before, my name is Claire Archibald. I'm one of the Senior Data Protection Officers and the Service Manager at the Education Data Hub. We provide Data Protection Officer as a service to around 400 schools now. Prior to this role, I worked in a school myself. I was a school business manager, and many of my colleagues also worked in schools, either as senior leaders or in the office functions of the school. So we do know schools really well. Okay, so hopefully some of you here today came to my last section talking about the most common causes of data breaches in schools and how to prevent them. And you will remember that I shared the sorrowful story of Peabody Primary School and the hapless Polly Jones, the deputy head teacher, who found herself having the week from hell because there were data breaches after data breaches, incidents and near misses, and Polly seemed to be quite blissfully unaware of the disasters that were befalling around her. So it became apparent that in Peabody Primary School, there were a number of data protection practices that were somewhat lacking at that school. So I'm going to pick up the story again. You will remember that we left Polly at the end of a horrible week. So let's just recap some of the things that happened during the week. You can see here, this is my little summary of all our data incidents over the course of the week. I'll just pick a couple just to give you a little bit of a flavour of that week. So firstly, on Monday morning, we had Polly accessing a school system and finding that there were a number of previous staff that were still showing as active users on an IT system which contained pupil personal data. Then on Tuesday, we saw a pupil accessing a teacher's unlocked laptop. Wednesday, we saw a photo of a child being uploaded to the school website without the proper consent. Thursday, we had a phishing attack that went unnoticed. And by Friday, the most disastrous incident of them all, we saw a really serious error where information about a parent being arrested was displayed on the interactive whiteboard to a stunned class, including the child of that parent. So we left Polly going home on that Friday night and drowning her sorrows in a bottle of wine. But what happened next? As you can imagine, Monday morning when Polly returned to work was pretty uncomfortable as the ramifications of everything that had happened the previous week became more and more apparent. Yes, as you probably anticipated, the incident regarding that display of that information about that parent's arrest on the whiteboard it was reported to the ICO. The parent made a formal complaint and that is still rumbling on. The ICO made a number of recommendations for improvement as part of their response to that data breach report. So as a result, the school decided to appoint a new member of staff on a fixed term contract to come and act as the data protection officer. And this is Diane. She's going to drive some rapid improvements at the school and she's going to turn some things around. Diane was created by artificial intelligence, by the way. I used an artificial intelligence image generator for this. She's not a real person. So Diane, as I say, was a successful applicant. She'd previously worked in banking data protection compliance. And in her interview, she explains that she's got fantastic results because she's really good at driving through rapid change. So the head teacher, you'll remember him perhaps, Ben Frost, and the governors, they were really relieved to hear that they'd been able to appoint such a strong candidate. So Diane starts at the school and she knows that the first thing she wants to do is understand the full scope of the current compliance picture. So she sets about her mission by conducting a full audit of compliance, examining documents, interviewing staff and inspecting workstations around the site. Once she's got a handle on what's going wrong, she is intending to bring a full assessment to the senior leadership team in a meeting. So Diane keeps a notebook on her at all times to make any observations. Polly, in particular, as you can imagine, is very nervous, keeps her head down and tries to avoid the beady eye of Diane. So Diane, initially, she comes into the school, she's really shocked by the differences between the school and the banking environment she worked in previously. So she's thinking about some of those tools that she used at the bank. So she used to do things like desk checks when staff left their workstations unattended, and she hosted an annual online data protection module. And there appears to be none of this rigour in this new crazy environment. So Diane arrives at work one morning to find that Ben, the head teacher, hasn't arrived, but she's eager to get him before the staff and the pupils take over his day. So she hovers around, watches him arrive at work, and she enters his office. So she slips in a few minutes later because she wants to do some checks with him. This time, she wants to talk about the importance of locking filing cabinets. And she looks around and she can see that there are several filing cabinets in the room. Every single one of them has already got a key in it. Ben sees Diane looking at the keys, and they both know what the next question's going to be. Ben feels completely humiliated at having his mistake being pointed out by Diane. He feels a little bit like one of Gordon Ramsay's sous chefs being roared at for their idiocy. One of the next big things in Diane's sight is the amount of EdTech products the school are using. She can see that no DPIAs have ever been completed, and so she decides that she's going to launch a full-scale review of all these providers. She gathers a list of what's being used and then reviews the documentation for all of those vendors. She's got bad news for the staff. At least 5 of those providers don't have the documents that confirm that they comply with data protection laws. And so what does she do? She refuses to proceed with the DPIAs for those and tells the teachers that they need to stop using those platforms with immediate effect. Finally, it's time for her to present her findings to the senior leadership team. Diane sets out explaining how the school should have documented a lawful basis for each processing and created the Article 30 records of processing activity for that work. The senior leadership team are completely bewildered. They can't understand what Diane is talking about, how it will reduce the risk of data breach. Finally, Diane sets out her vision for compliance improvement, and she's decided to set out the entire roadmap for her team and for the 18 months that she's got this fixed term contract for. As far as she can see it, the work needs to start as soon as possible. So poor Polly Jones is in that meeting and she feels terrified, and she wonders how on earth she's going to get through the next 18 months working with this new colleague. This is pretty horrible stuff, isn't it? And once again, we're going to leave Peabody School on a cliffhanger. So what has my story got to do with compliance, and what's it got to do with culture? So actually, this is quite a personal story for me. Working with schools on data protection compliance for the last 5 years has been a fantastic and sometimes scary journey. And I'm embarrassed and ashamed to admit that actually Diane and I definitely had some attributes in common, certainly early on when I started working as a DPO for schools. So this is why I wanted to take this last session in the set of 3 that I'm talking to you about the importance of a positive data protection compliance and what I've sort of come to say is compliance with kindness. And you can see here, I've linked to a couple of I'm going to link to a couple of things here that I'm going to show that have really helped me on my journey, and I'd like to share with you. It's easy as a data protection specialist, if you're in your school, to get really caught up in the technicalities of the law, to make sure that you've got all of your documents with your T's crossed and your I's dotted, making sure things like that record of processing activity are perfected. But actually, it's really important to turn your attention to this kind of vitally important but really intangible thing called culture. Culture is going to be like a shadow to everything that you're trying to achieve. So what I really want you to do today is to encourage you to think about and communicate and document those considerations of culture as part of your compliance program. So let's talk about some of the things that I think are really worth tuning into. So first of all, I've picked out a podcast, and a particular episode of a podcast. So this is a podcast called Women in Compliance. It's a really great podcast. It talks about all aspects of compliance, but this one in particular is a nice one about how to have kind compliance. So I'd recommend listening to that, searching it for that. But one of the key turning points for me, my personal journey in a data protection officer, was reading this fantastic book by a lady called Christy Grant-Hart. Christy really gets to grips with some of the special skills that you need to have when you are working in compliance. And if you are listening to this and you are a school business manager, or if you have a senior kind of business role in school, you do have compliance. You are a compliance officer as part of your role. And it's really key, I think, to note that Christy doesn't just talk about data protection compliance. The skills that you have as a data protection compliance officer are just as valid for things like health and safety, cyber security, financial regulations. So having this idea of understanding the soft skills that you need in order to drive a positive culture are really applicable to lots of your functions in the school, even if data protection is just one of them. So I'd really recommend Christy's book to you all. It's not particularly expensive, and I thought it was a really great read. There are also some really great leaders on platforms such as LinkedIn talking about culture and positive culture, and I'd particularly recommend a lady called Ellie Dowsett to you. She has some really wise and kind and engaging posts about navigating culture change in your organisation. So do look out for her and people like her. And I really want to share with you some a document and some work by the Commissioner, the Data Protection Commissioner for the Bailiwick of Guernsey, a lady called Emma Martins. She's the Commissioner, and she's been leading Guernsey in some really positive work around data protection. And Emma was a keynote at the last IRMS conference, and she really resonated with me. She spoke very passionately about why you should comply with data protection laws, and really talked about how data protection rights and democracy were really fragile, and therefore those fragile things were worthy of needing to be taken care of. And so she really spoke quite the emotional journey as to why these things are important. But her document here, and if you just search on an internet browser the Feel Good Guide to Data Protection, you will find it quite easily. Both her keynote at the RMS and her document really talk about how we treat personal data is really how we treat each other as people. And so really talking about how to approach that project with a positive mindset and to make people feel good about compliance. So do have a look at that. Have a look at that guide. Use that guide with your staff in your school, and perhaps you could even look at tailoring your own kind of in-house version as to how your school feels good about their compliance work. And finally, what I would say is, you know, you're going to have ups and downs when you're trying to drive a compliance program. Some things are going to go well, some things don't go well. But, you know, the knack of life is to get back up 8 times, isn't it, when you've not been knocked down 7? So actually, as a data protection officer or as a data lead in your school, you know, every time you have a situation that doesn't go particularly well, just think, well, what could go better next time, and try to keep positive like that. So that's just a little bit about my journey. So hopefully I'm just starting to kind of persuade you as to the validity of a positive data protection culture. But let's look in detail at culture and how to create a culture that supports change in a positive way and supports the health and the mental well-being of all the staff in the school. Diane, in my fictional Peabody story, was I think admirable for her strong stance, but ultimately I think she set up that school for a really difficult 18 months. Luckily, there aren't many people who are as scary and as unapproachable as Diane in schools, and I think all of you here today would understand that an approach like Diane's would be really alarming and off-putting. Those several key decisions by Diane and that leadership team who appointed her meant that they've gone from kind of a culture of ignorance about data protection, compliance, to actually a really negative culture really, really early on. So again, I'm going to move on from the fictional story of Peabody. Let's talk about what you can do in your school to establish that positive culture. So what is culture? So you can see from this definition that there are some very key words. So we're talking about a shared set of beliefs and values that are established by leaders, and they have got to be effectively communicated and reinforced by their action. And you need all of those elements in that sentence in order to establish the right sort of culture in your organisation. Make no mistake, if you don't plan for a culture, there will still be a culture, but maybe the one that you didn't intend. And so your well-planned strategy may be eaten up by culture. You'll have all heard of that phrase, culture eats strategy for breakfast. But actually, why don't culture and strategy have breakfast together? So again, hopefully I'm persuading you that as part of your compliance program, you should be explicitly discussing and articulating the culture that you want and its role in your program. Okay, so I'm just going to spend some time here encouraging you all to think about the current culture in your school. Have you got a carrot or a stick approach? So actually, some water. I know that when GDPR was born in 2018, in schools, there was a lot of fear around ICO investigations, talk of fines of being 4% of turnover and prosecutions of individuals. And back in 2017, 2018, I think we were all feeling very afraid. So let's have a look at what actually happened. So let's think about what's happened to the ICO. Have we found that we've got anything to fear the ICO from? So looking at those levels of those much feared fines in schools, what have we got 5 years later? The total sum of fines issued in schools has been 0. There have been a handful of reprimand letters for schools. So actually the picture's looking different 5 years on, isn't it? So actually last week I spent some time talking to the ICO about the pressures on school staff, and believe me, they are sympathetic to the burdens that you are facing in schools. So it's really clear that that stick approach of 2017, 2018 is no longer appropriate. So perhaps you've got some different kind of cultures. So maybe you've got this culture of fear that's still hanging over from a few years ago. Maybe you've got this kind of too busy culture. So this, something in the way, it's getting in the way, it's distracting or blocking you from progress. And I can understand why schools might think that. Schools have been under huge amounts of pressure to develop ways of working digitally really quickly, whether that's adopting Google Classrooms, Dojo, Office 365, etc. And I get and I see that schools haven't always been given the support and understanding that actually they need to incorporate data protection work as part of those projects as well. It's always been seen as a bit of a blocker in the way of progress. So you get this kind of too busy, it's not important, and I'm too busy kind of culture. Or perhaps you've got a culture of inertia where your school staff just feel completely overwhelmed. The task of complying feels too big, and so they have a bit of an ostrich in this sort of head in the sand kind of mentality because it all feels too big and too hard. Or perhaps your school is my favourite type of school to work with, which is the angry culture. And I think these schools are great fun to work with because they have so much energy. They're just directing it in a really negative way. So while they're being really angry about data protection, it does show that they actually really care. I have a particular opinion about this sort of culture, and you may have heard me saying it before. It's well summed up by my friend Yoda. Fear leads to anger, anger leads to hate, and hate leads to the dark side. So have a think about your culture. Does it fall into one of these sort of categories? Is it driven by fear? Is it you're too busy? Is it that you've got an inertia and you feel overwhelmed? Or actually are staff really angry and they're angrily protesting that it's nothing to do with them? So think about where you are at the moment. Perhaps you're already in that positive space and you've come to this webinar just to confirm what a good job you're doing, and hurrah for you if you are. Okay, so let's have a look at some of the benefits of driving a positive data protection culture. Let's get into that nitty-gritty of what you're going to do, and actually the benefits of the culture and selling the benefits are a really important part of what you're doing. The good news is that you don't have to drive this culture alone. You're not going to be the sole flag bearer in your organisation. So let's talk about some of the obvious reasons why you might want to have a data protection, to do some data protection work. So yeah, we know that you're going to have a reduction in complaints, breaches and all that work. You do the proactive work and it's going to stop those ugly problems. It's a bit like fixing your roof before the rain sets in. You're going to have better protected data subjects, and in schools we're very used to hearing data protection as an extension to your safeguarding responsibilities. We know that your record of processing activity is not just a document that's going to help you to comply with the law. It's going to give you that great central overview of operations. It's going to help you to save money by removing duplicating systems, and it's going to help to streamline what you're doing and having a sort of bird's eye view of what's going on. And of course, it's going to help you to reduce cyber risk, keep your data secure, have less of it, manage your records better. Okay, so of course, those are the benefits, and of course the law says what those benefits are. And it's kind of easy to say, oh, well, we've got to comply because the law says that we've got to, but actually there's some really key reasons above and beyond these sort of four that I've summarised here, that it's a really beneficial thing for your school. So I think you're going to have a better understanding of your risk management. So senior leaders in schools, particularly those in multi-academy trusts, should have a really good grasp on risk management and understanding where your risks are, including in your cybersecurity and data protection risk. It's part of your corporate responsibility. The Department for Education makes it clear that schools have got to get a handle on risk management processes, and data protection really ties into that. But also, I think the benefits, the positive stuff are, if you are positive with your workforce, you're going to have a confident and protected workforce themselves. They're going to invest in the culture because they understand that it's their personal data that's also being treated with this respect. They will feel that it's like a safe place to work, a sense of belonging, and they will have a really core understanding of the values of your organisation when it comes to doing things the right way in a positive, proactive way. And I always put this on, I think there are some schools out there who quite rightly want to celebrate their successes. Senior leaders like to use social media platforms like LinkedIn or X to really talk about their success as a multi-academy trust. And so actually I would really say that do add this as a string to your bow. You know, talk about how important it is to your school, and have it as something to show off about, and have it as something that those senior leaders are going to be sort of really waving the flag for you. So as I say, the first thing when you start a project on data protection is not to do what Diane did, and the first thing is not to immediately launch into your compliance program by doing that big audit of compliance. The first thing you need to be doing is engaging those senior leaders. They're the ones who are going to be leading the charge for you, and you've got to embed that positive culture in them. So do have that conversation with those senior leaders about the benefits of doing it your way, if you like, be a good salesperson. Why should they engage and lead on this? Ultimately, hopefully that should be an easy win. Ultimately, they brought you in and they're either paying for you to do the specific role of data protection, or they've decided that it's got to be part of your job description, and they've given you hopefully some recognition, financial recognition for that. So hopefully you're already there, but again, do that sales job to them and engage with them as the first instance. Right, so how are you going to start this culture change program? I've kind of touched on this already, but I'm going to touch on it again. So we've talked about that programme, not being driven by fear, but actually driving a programme by positivity and kindness, and hopefully some of those benefits. So how do you actually then get started? Well, you can't just put in new policies and procedures. You've got to train your staff, and you've got to, so you can't just, put the policies and procedures, run some kind of standardized training and then expect the culture to change overnight. That's just not going to happen. Change can be really difficult. It's not always difficult, it's frequently difficult. So you do need a really good plan of how you're going to drive that culture change. I've already touched on the senior leadership buy-in element of it, so I'm going to touch on that again. I would really recommend that you start your work with that senior leadership team. If you haven't already, if you're already working through a programme of compliance, do go back now, check in with SLT and get that buy-in for them. You need to understand what motivates them, what their values and goals are, what the values and goals of the school are. And you really need to tie your data protection agenda into that. And just remember my quote earlier about that culture being driven and demonstrated by leaders. So the culture has got to be kind of a flag waved by those leaders, and they've also got to kind of walk the walk as well as talk the talk. Okay, so once you've got that SLT buy-in, once you've got that strategy agreed with them, you should make sure that you're communicating really well with the staff in the school. Stakeholder management is a massive part of having a successful change management programme. So you need to make sure, as I say, first of all, what I recommend is that you have a good communications plan. So what I often do with schools is I will set out a year's worth or so of kind of rough communication kind of plans, messaging in the plan, and talk about or how those comms are going to land with everybody in the school. So if you've got a particularly large school, you need to make sure that you're reaching out to the various staff groups in the way that they communicate, the way that they meet, and you make sure that you're reaching those. Obviously in small schools, that means probably you are going to be going and talking to each individual staff member regularly. And as part of your comms plan, you've got to make sure that you're keeping staff updated on where you are in your plan, what your whole plan is, and then telling them where you're at. So this is where we've got to this term. So, what's been achieved. So, this term we have achieved great success because everybody is now clearing down their desks at the end of the day. This term we have achieved great success because 90% of all the staff have attended data protection training. And so on and so forth. So really concrete kind of goals and waypoints in your journey. Keep communicating, keep inviting feedback. So invite the staff to join a conversation. I'm really conscious that I'm just talking at this blank screen for 3/4 of an hour and we're not having a conversation, are we? I'm just projecting. So please don't do that. Make sure that you are having communication two ways, that you're inviting feedback, invite staff to join a conversation. So don't tell people, well, this is what you must do to prevent a data breach. Maybe ask them to make suggestions. Oh, why do we think this keeps going on? What do you think we could do better? And ask them to make those suggestions. Perhaps do things like have spot prizes for really great suggestions, or send somebody a thank you. This is really cheesy, but it lands really well with the schools that I work with. I might email them and they say something to me, they give me some feedback, and I'll just say something like, do you know what, that's absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much. That's such a great suggestion. I'm going to give you my data protection gold star for the day. And people just love that. They just love that little bit of recognition. It makes a massive difference. If you are in a particularly large school or trust, what I would say is look for people who engage with you, look for them and invite them to join you as your data protection champions. Give them that status and visibility, a certificate for their office, a recognition in a staff meeting, all of those things. So again, stakeholder management, acknowledging the work that everybody's doing, taking time to say, we've done really well this term because we've achieved this, is a really positive spin on we have a lot of work to do to improve compliance. Okay, so the next thing is actually what your plan needs to look like. How do you draw your plan? And again, hopefully you're going to be really talking to your SLT and making sure that you draw this plan up. My personal observations on managing a data protection program is that you always split your work into smaller projects and always start building your house from the foundation stones up. So it's no good doing, 50 retrospective DPIAs like Diane wanted to do in our fictional school. She wanted to do all of these DPIAs because she realised that schools had never done them. That kind of feels like something that's a bit further up in that building, going back and checking the stuff that's already been done. So again, as I say, start on those foundation stones. What's the big steps that you need to put in place before you can build from there? Traditionally, a data protection purist, a data protection consultant would always say, start your data protection project from the records of processing activities. So understanding all of your processing, understanding the legal basis for it all, getting it mapped into a data map, then building that kind of scary looking spreadsheet or platform with your Article 30 records of processing activity. However, I'm going to say something controversial here, and if you're a data protection expert and you disagree with me, you can suck air into your teeth now. I don't think that's a particularly helpful approach for schools. There you are. I think it's very difficult for schools to relate that, for staff to relate that to what they're actually doing. And I think it can be a little bit overwhelming, particularly in schools where your legal basis for processing everything is almost always public task or legal obligation. So I think, and this is an IRMS webinar after all, I think a good records management project is a great place to start as that foundation stone. And you'll know I've talked about this before. Good records management is going to help you comply with so many of the data protection principles. It's going to help you to hit things like data minimization, data security, storage limitation, as well as making things that come up like subject access requests so much easier to manage. So if you want a really big early impact, records management is a great place to start, and it's going to also help you to get your school cleared up. So if you've got cupboards full of data, or if you've got servers that are groaning with documents, records management is a really good place to start, I think. Wherever you start, make sure that what you're doing is real and relatable, and so that the groups are really engaging and understanding what they need to do as part of their job. Okay. You must make sure that you've got some really good training in place and that it's adapted to those different staff roles. It needs to actually relate to what the cleaner does as part of their role, or the senior leadership team, or the maths lead. Your policies next. Your policies need to be an actual statement of intent. They're not a statement of kind of lofty ambition where, they're going to be stuff that you are actually going to do. Make sure that those policies are supported by procedures, standards and guidelines. So those procedures, standards and guidelines are what school staff are going to be engaging with on a daily basis. So make them really accessible. Checklists, short videos, posters, reminder sheets, prompts in things like procurement forms. Have you done a DPIA with a tick box to say yes or no? All of those little things. So, just embed it in. So have your policies and then have them well supported by procedures, standards and guidelines. And I've seen some schools do some really great things about procedures for sending pupil files to the next setting, or procedures for reviewing EdTech platforms to make sure data's sort of purged from platforms. Finally, before I move on to the next slide, you need to draw governors' attention to this. Your governors, your trustees are going to have some responsibilities for that strategic oversight, and they are a really important group because they're going to help to hold you to account. And when you win the lottery and you emigrate to a fabulous island to sip pina coladas in the sun, you've actually got then, if you've got it in the governance structure of the school, you've got it embedded and it's a legacy that's going to kind of outlive you in your school. So make sure that you are drawing your governor's attention to documents like the DFE Data Protection Toolkit for Schools, because that talks about governors' responsibilities for oversight. KICSI, again, talks about governors' responsibility for oversight of compliance with data protection law. Cybersecurity standards for schools, all of these talk about that leadership oversight. So make sure you're training the governance level as well. And perhaps you could even draft up like a set of questions that the governors could ask you every year to make sure that they're holding you and your successors to account. Okay, so hopefully I'm selling this to you. How do you want to if you want to drive that positive compliance program, you're going to need to demonstrate that positivity and that compassion yourself in a leader. And as I said earlier, I've listened to a lot to kind of culture change experts, and their advice is really consistent on that point. And you can see again that Diane at Peabody Primary, she did not manage a good job of this. So you have to be, in the words of Ellie Dowsett, who I mentioned earlier, you have to be hungry, humble, hungry, and emotionally intelligent. And this is something that Christy Grant Hart really touched on in her book as well. So successful compliance managers make sure that they're visible within their organisation and that their role is seen kind of like as part of a bigger Venn diagram. So not just a Venn diagram in terms of records management or data protection and IT functions, but actually the other teams as well. So make sure that you're talking to your colleagues in finance and HR. Make sure that you're going and talking and sitting in the staff room, listening to those conversations of what those teachers are talking about, what's next on the horizon for them. You really need to go into those networks and find out what they're planning. Make sure that they're you're not waiting for them to come and see you. My bottom point here, be tolerant of difference. So you need to understand that everybody that comes to you in school doesn't have the same appetite for risk or procedure. Some people will feel kind of personally triggered into an alarm state much earlier than others. Some staff will come in really pumped up with an idea and will want to run with it, whereas others will be much more introspective. And so you need to meet those people at the energy level that they're at, but actually you need to meet them consistently as well. That sounds really hard, doesn't it? But you need to understand that, for some people, you don't want to alarm them sort of needlessly. So just be aware that some of the language, some of the terms that you could discuss with them could actually lead to a staff member feeling very worried and needing lots of reassurance from you. Okay, so you need to be a salesperson. You don't often think of sort of compliance and sales as going hand in hand, but you are actually selling a vision, and so do use your sales techniques. Make sure that you're clear and consistent and avoid jargon and complicated language. And again, make sure that you're being consistent. So if your policy is that your school will tolerate uploading pupil personal data to, vendors in the US where, you haven't got the right terms and conditions, make sure that you're consistently applying that decision across the different departments in the school and be really collaborative. My final bullet point is to try and say, when people come to you, yes and, not no but. When you start a sentence with no but, you start with a negative and you start from a premise of, well, I disagree with you on this. And that actually becomes a really negative kind of self-fulfilling prophecy then. So if you say, yes, and we can do this, yes, that sounds great, and we need to do a DPIA. You start with something that you agree with and you build from there. That's a much more effective approach, and it's going to really help to reduce conflict. And those school staff that you're working with are going to see that you are on their side. So as I say, try to start with yes. You're opening yourself up to a much more productive relationship, because ultimately you want a situation where everybody walks away a winner. Everybody walks away with their dignity intact. You don't want to be like poor Ben Frost being humiliated. You want to make sure that everybody feels that they're all working towards the same goals and everybody's on the same side. You're not, the department of no. Okay, so top 10 habits for you to start as a data protection lead or data protection officer in your school. So have a little bit of a summary. So you really need a communications plan. And that needs to tie in to your roadmap. You know, where do you want to go? How long is it going to take you to do this? If you say, right, we're going to achieve data protection compliance this year, I think you're setting yourself up for a difficult year and a bit of a fall. I think if you're saying, right, this term we're going to work on this thing, next term we're going to work on the next thing. So theme those terms. So, you know, obviously October is Cybersecurity Awareness Month. So your autumn term could be cybersecurity, and really everybody working on making sure that they're doing the cybersecurity. So, you know, spring term could be about making sure that everybody attends all the data protection training. Summer term could be about really making sure that we're reviewing all of those contracts that we've got with our external vendors and start to look at, you know, putting them on the records of processing activity, making sure we've done our DPIAs. Anyway, you know, those are just some examples. Make sure that you are getting in early with new staff as they start working in your school. So make sure that you are speaking to your colleagues in HR. Perhaps you're also the HR lead in your school. I know I certainly was when I was a business manager. I did it, you know, it was a bit of everything. So make sure that you're spending some time in induction, talking about data protection, cybersecurity, and sort of, you know, the positive culture that you have in your school. Say we have a really positive culture in our school, and we know that everybody's only doing our best. A reiteration of what I've already said, try to avoid being the department of no. So, you know, if you need to review a DPIA and it looks horribly non-compliant, just don't say, no, I'm not going to do that DPIA, that's horribly non-compliant. Ultimately, it's not necessarily your decision to decide whether something is going to go ahead or not. It's the senior leadership's team. So actually, you know, do that DPIA, but set out the risks. You know, yes, you can do this. Yes, and you can do this. And these are the things that you're going to need to consider. Focus on what staff are doing really well. Do take time to appraise and to thank people, to call out those early successes, you know, give some stats. 90% of the people that we sent that phishing simulation email to didn't click on the link. That's absolutely brilliant. You know, this term I noticed that, you know, we had far less incidences of staff leaving their laptops unlocked when they went on their lunch break, etc. So turning it around into what's doing really well, and do more of that. Again, make sure that you're reporting into the leaders. I've talked about making sure that they're part of that initial strategy, but make sure you keep reporting in to that senior leadership team and to the governance oversight as well. A really big one for me personally is to avoid that temptation to do that Gordon Ramsay moment of roaring at people when things go wrong. We are only human, mistakes do happen. I talked about this in my data protection, in my data breach webinar as well. So do empathise when mistakes happen. If somebody comes to you and reports a breach, the first thing to do is check out that they're okay, you know, and thank them for bringing it to your attention. You know, going around and having a really kind of shouting at people, oh my God, I can't believe you did that sort of thing, is really a difficult situation for those staff. They're probably feeling horrendous about what's happened anyway. Use plain language when talking. I mean, I know I've mentioned things like ROPA once or twice during this webinar. I try not to use that word very often. I think it's quite off-putting. It doesn't really relate to people. Same for DPIAs. DPIAs, talk about them being risk assessments. Things like, you know, your data breaches, again, talk about them in sort of analogies, talk about them as if they were the same as an accident, a data accident. So keep that plain language and keep relating it to things that school staff understand really well. Make sure that you're checking in with your colleagues, you know, what's on the horizon. Make sure that you're keeping into the network and talking to them, not just talking at them, as I am doing now. And again, this is a slight reiteration, but really choose your focus. Don't say, right, I'm going to do data protection. It's ultimately going to feel like a hard job if you don't have those kind of sort of steps in the road. Okay, so that's what I wanted to say about compliance culture. I hope you've enjoyed that. Now, just at the last 5 minutes, I just want to talk about the IRMS Schools Group and what we've been doing this year and where we want to take it next. So, as you know, this year I've hosted 3 webinars. There was the one about the records management in schools and ICSA. There was a webinar about data breaches, and then there was this one today. Please, please, please share your feedback on these sessions with this email address at the bottom. What went well? What was good? What would you like to see more of? What would you like to see less of? Ultimately, as a group, we need to decide where we are going to go from here. Sorry, I can see people popping things in about chats in the chat. This chat will disappear. It will poof away at the end of the webinar. So we'll look at the questions in a few moments. But if you've got feedback on what you want to see, do pop it in that email. You don't have to be polite in the email. Just quickly bung it down in that email, because that will be kept. Right, okay, but we will deal with your questions. So where do we go from here as a schools group? So schools group has been fantastically looked after by the chair of the public sector group, Elizabeth. So thank you so much, Elizabeth, for looking after us for the last 15 months or so. Schools are a really important part of the records management, information governance, cybersecurity, child protection landscape, and as a group we really need a voice. Okay, it is clear that we have a role to play as the IRMS schools group, because after all, the Department for Education has linked to the IRMS guidance in their data protection toolkit, which I think shows our role in the sector. But what we need you. We are looking for the next chair of the schools group. So what we would like is, perhaps you're listening to this and you're thinking this could be a next great step in your career. You'd like to represent schools. You'd like to get more involved with the IRMS. We are very much a friendly group, and we really want to encourage people who feel that this might be good for them to step forward. You get lots of benefits if you are acting as the chair of the group. You get to have your finger on the pulse. You get to shape some really exciting stuff. You get to have a voice. People will listen to you because you'll be the chair of the schools group. You also get a really good discount on the IRMS annual conference, which is fantastic. I went to the last 2. So if you could see yourself as the chair of the group, please email schools@IRMS, or reach out to me or Elizabeth on social media and talk to us about whether it's right for you. So what are our plans for next year? So we are going to have more webinars on topics that you want to hear about. So we are planning to do these around about June and October 2024. So we'll have 2 next year. So we want to hear what you're going to talk about. Perhaps you're listening to this and you're thinking you'd love an opportunity to talk at people for an hour like I have. So if you'd like to deliver, we'd be absolutely delighted to hear from you, but we will try and find you some good speakers on the topics that you want to hear about. I can see there's a chat on this. There's a question in the chat about the records retention guidance. That work has been done. We've hit a bit of a bump in the road in terms of the IRMS toolkit, in terms of the uploading of it onto the digital platform. So not currently got some news on that. We are waiting to hear, but we will be having a new IRMS toolkit. I just can't give you the date for that. What I can confirm is that the new IRMS toolkit requires you to have IRMS membership to access it. It is going to be behind that paywall. So you need some information about how you're going to access that. It's been really revised to take into account all of the latest legislation, including things like the end of ICSA. So school membership, if you are a school and you want to join, it's a complete bargain for you to join. It's just £45 a year, and that includes, if you're a multi-academy trust, the first school in a multi-academy trust. And then if you want to add on extra schools as that multi-academy trust, it's kind of £20 extra for each school. As I say, there is a delay on publishing the toolkit. We will publish it extensively when it is released and when you'll be able to access it. But as I say, you will need to be a member to access it at that point. So in the interim, Ruth Figg has very kindly agreed to step up and help to look after the group until we appoint a chair. So Ruth and I are going to look after the group. And so Ruth, I think, is very kindly agreed to kind of look after the emails. I'll look after making sure that we get speakers booked in for June and October, and we'll work together. But as I say, hopefully this has inspired somebody to come and say, we'd love to talk, or we'd love to be the chair of the group. So that's it. Let's have a look at some questions.
I think there's only the one, Claire, and that was somebody, let me just go for it, from Lynn, who says, can you say more about records management, as you mentioned this as a good starting point?
Yes. Oh yeah. Records management is something that everybody in schools, I think, can really relate to. It's also something that's really changed, hasn't it, over the recent years. And when I talked about the records management webinar, which is uploaded to the YouTube channel, by the way. So if you go to IRMS YouTube channel, you will see that that video's there and it's uploaded. I've seen it. So records management is a really good way of starting a sort of a data protection program, and it helps to get some really early buy-ins. So, you know, make sure that you're reviewing your records retention policy. I'm really saying that, and I'm conscious that we haven't got an up-to-date toolkit for you, which is not great. Yeah, so if you start with making sure that you're really looking at your policy and then going and really engaging people with that policy and saying, we need your help to sort of start to manage those records, then you can start to touch on and start to introduce aspects of the data protection compliance. It's not basically, go to the webinar is what I'm trying to say, because I can't say it in just a few seconds. The cost for the school to subscribe to the IRMS would be £45 per school. And if you're a multi-academy trust, it's £45 for the first school in the multi-academy trust, and then £20 if other schools in that MAT want to join as well. I can't see any more questions there, can you?
No, I can't. I have just put in the chat, if you would like to talk to somebody about what being a group chair actually involves, then please do use the schools@irms.org.uk, and we will arrange for you to speak to either the group's director or to one of we other group chairs. So I can say I've been a group chair now for over 20 years, and I find it immensely rewarding. You don't have to sign up for 20 years. That was just my choice. But it is something that where you do get an immense feeling of being able to assist the professional community and to build on the building bricks for people. So I can strongly recommend being a group chair, but you really don't have to sign up for 20 years. Yeah, in terms of Emma's what she's asked, is, will there be comms once a new toolkit? Yes, indeed there will. The IRMS will be trumpeting it from the rooftops. One of the reasons why it's been slightly delayed, to answer Victoria's question, is that we are moving away from a published printed document to a true toolkit, which will be a whole series of web pages with the information on, with lots of hyperlinks to jump between. So there won't be downloadable resources as there have been in the past. This will be an interactive resource, and the reason why we've done it that way is so that we can keep it up to date easily, rather than having to put it through a complete, and as I'm sure Claire will back me up in this, incredibly painful review process. This way we will be able to alter the retention as the law changes, and just to keep it going as a dynamic document. But that's why it will be or dynamic toolkit. So all the content you would expect, including the retention schedule, is there, but it's not in a not in a downloadable format per se, because what we want to do is to be able to keep it up to date. And one of the things that we've been very aware of is that some organisations have downloaded the toolkit in its entirety, and that's brilliant, but then it's not being kept up to date because the organisation itself hasn't got a review process, and so it can get dangerous if the retention schedule gets obsolete. So I hope that helps. I mean, I haven't seen the final web design yet. I know roughly what it's going to look like, and it does look, but at the moment, our plans are it will look actually really quite swish. But the content itself won't have changed a huge amount in terms of what content there is. We've simplified the content a bit, haven't we, Claire? In terms of
simplified it, and I think obviously, I think the previous toolkit talked about hold on to everything because ICS is still ongoing, but ICS is not ongoing anymore. So I've got a really great question here from Sally, and I really like it. How do you recommend tackling past educational platforms that have been implemented prior to our due diligence process? And this is something I see loads and loads, Sally, and I often go and I work with a school and start that kind of data protection review period, and really they want to get stuck in straight away, and they're like, oh, all right, I'm going to do 30 DPIAs this term on all the stuff that we've already got in place. So DPIAs are a risk assessment process. So you're already doing the risky thing. It's already happening. And I suppose really what you want to be doing is thinking about risk assessing the biggest risks first. So if I was risk assessing and I was looking at all of these, due diligence and risk assessments that haven't been done, first of all, I would think, well, that's done now. There's not much I can do about that in today, but actually what I can do today is make sure that going forward, I have the risk assessments happening before I go on the school trip. I.e., we're not writing our risk assessment after the fact. So we'll make sure that our risk assessments going forward are done. And then what we do then in terms of ordering that retrospective review, a couple of things I would say is look at your biggest risks first. So which kind of external vendors are you using that have the most sensitive pupil data? So is it your CPOMs or your My Concern platform? Is it your management information system? Is it perhaps your SEND platform that you're, something like Provision Map or something like that? So look at those things, those systems that are holding the most sensitive data about your staff and pupils. Is it your HR system that has got everybody's national insurance numbers on and addresses and your single central record? Where's that sort of stored? So look at those big ones. And then like a risk assessment, I think, order them in terms of the most risky first, and then review them as you come across them. So when a risk changes, so perhaps you've always used, I don't know, I'm going to talk about TT Rockstars. You've always used TT Rockstars and the staff at your school have always just uploaded pupils' names directly into TT Rockstars to use it. And now they say, actually, we want to do it and we want to use Wand to automate all of that for us. That's a change in that process. That's a change in that risk. So that's a good time to do the DPIA for that. Riskiest first, then when a risk changes, then if a risk becomes apparent, what if one of them has a data breach or, you get email from a vendor saying there's been such and such a problem, data's been exposed. That's a good time to redo the DPIA for that. Hopefully you're not in that situation too often. And then other things to look at are when a vendor comes to you and says, oh, we've been taken over by a parent company. So for instance, I know that the safeguarding company, My Concern, they were taken over. My Concern were My Concern, then they were the safeguarding company, and now I think they're owned by TES. So that sort of thing, terms and conditions kind of being updated, getting those notifications, that's another good time to do it. So hopefully that helps you to order that work. What I would say is, though, don't do that retrospective risk assessment work at the expense of those foundation stones in your building. So make sure that you are focusing on stuff that's really going to have an impact, and don't do that thing where you go, oh my gosh, these are all horribly non-compliant, we must stop using them all. That was a long, detailed answer to that question, but it's something I see a lot, and I hope that's helped you, Sally.
We have had quite a few comments, questions about the schools toolkit. If you have got questions about the schools toolkit, I can certainly try to answer them, but rather than using the schools toolkit or the schools address, if you could use my IRMS address, then I was to save that Claire and Ruth having to deal with those inquiries. If you could use the address I've put in the chat, then I will do my best to answer your questions, because at the moment, obviously, I'm the general editor of the toolkit. Yes, the current toolkit will disappear altogether when the new one is launched, and membership will be required. The old toolkit is now starting to get to the point where it is quite out of date, and we've left it because we decided it was better to have something rather than nothing on the website. But the current toolkits will all be retired once the new toolkit is ready. So if anyone hasn't got any other questions, we are now coming up to 2:30, so I'd like to say a huge thank you to Claire, as always. The recording will be available for 2 weeks via Livestorm after the event, and we will discuss whether we want to have it uploaded to the YouTube channel, the RMS YouTube channel, but we will discuss that. If there are any questions about the RMS toolkit, please contact me, in case you hadn't worked out. I'm Elizabeth Barber, and I do chair public sector, and I'm the general editor of the schools toolkit, so it's my responsibility to answer questions. If you're interested in being the chair, please email on theschools@rms.org.uk. And so thank you very much, Claire, for your time and for the whole year, because it has made it much more straightforward for us to be able to relaunch the schools group with a single speaker and a whole series of absolutely brilliant content. So thank you very much, Claire.
Thanks, everybody.
We will hopefully, Claire and Ruth will look forward to welcoming you to the 2024 programme when it becomes available.
Yeah.
So I hope everyone has a wonderful afternoon.